How's everyone doing today?
Right.
Woken up? Yes? Excellent. So am I. Mostly. Thank you, Eric, and thank you. My God, this conference is amazing, so thank you for putting it on, and I think everyone should give, all the organizers a big round of applause. So who the fuck am I? Right. Hi, I'm Idan. I'm a designer slash developer mix. I'm like a weird combination of the two. And so I often talk about things at the intersection of design and development. And one of the things that's like near and dear to my heart specifically is typography. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about typography. I'm a core developer slash designer for the Django web framework, for those of you who have heard of that. And my day job is I visualize data, I guess. I don't know. There's no like good title for this yet. At Heroku, which is my generous employer who flew me all the way over here. So thank you, Heroku, for sending me over here as well. And yeah, so let's talk a little bit about psychology, right? There's a great author, Daniel Kahneman, wrote this book, talked about typography. What makes us think that something is true, right? What makes it easy for us to accept a given thing? And he actually specifically called out typography as something you can do to reduce cognitive load on the people that you were trying to transmit an idea to, right? So typography is something super important for people who are writing content and trying to get that content into other people's brains. But when I say typography, most of the time people, say, okay, so you're talking about fonts, right? Typefaces. And no, I'm also talking about typefaces, but they're a subset, right? Typography is actually far more than just fonts. Fonts are a big subset, but they're still just a subset. There's a lot more to it. Typography on the whole is the art and science of presenting textual information. And documentation is very much textual information. So how you communicate that to your users is actually really important. And I like to think about typography on two levels, right? Micro and macro. And the micro is the fonts part, right? Like how do individual letters look? How do they look together, right? If you think of type as like a fabric that you're weaving together, then the micro, you're thinking about the threads, like how these threads look and how they work and what their qualities and properties are. But at the macro, it's like the texture of type on a page, the architecture, how the different blocks of type work with one another, and how do you make it easy for your users to scan your content and parse your content and get to the bit that they're interested in so that they can figure out what they need to figure out so that they can get on with life, right? Which is the goal of all good documentation. And even before the advent of movable type, right, before we invented the printing press, scribes gave a lot of thought to the experience of how books were used, right? They came up with all these like interesting proportions and ways to lay out text on a page, even before we had a printing press. You have to remember that at this time, books cost like cars, right? Like you wouldn't just go out and buy a book. You'd like hire a team of people to like make your book a reality. And that team was super expensive. They were like all like, highly educated, the equivalent of like PhDs. You have a whole team of them writing your book. Right? And so they gave a lot of thought to how they lay their type out on the page. And remember, because they're very expensive, you can't just like reprint them. So you want to leave enough room for people's fingers not to touch the actual text, because fingers rub ink off over time. And books need to last for a long, long time because they're super expensive, right? And you can't just like, update, like, oh, we found like, we need to like publish some errata, right? Something has changed. You can't just go and like do like another printing. You have to like, leave room in the margins for this new information. So they came up with all this stuff to make it, easy for people to digest your text. But they all enjoyed one thing, which is control, right? They knew the size of their page. They knew how they were writing the type on the page, and they knew that the person that was consuming this documentation, this text, this whatever, was going to experience it exactly how they authored it, right? It's not going to change between now and when it like goes into somebody's eyeballs. But on the web, it's an inherently uncontrolled environment, right? There's literally no control. You can't control anything. It's super hostile. Like, you can't make any assumptions. You can't assume anything about the sizes of people's screens. Like, and what orientation they are. You don't control the lighting around them. And now it's even worse. Now you can't even control where they are. They're somewhere. like with these little tiny devices, and often in these most constrained settings is when they need you most, right? It's like, I really need to know how this thing works because I'm somewhere, I'm like trying to tech support something and all I have is my phone. Now, like, you know, so this is the moment in which you need to like really come through and deliver as documentarians. And they're distracted and under pressure, it's terrible. Right. So if you're writing content for the web, if you're writing documentation, how many people, like, you know, the end thing of what they write, how many of you are writing and it's going to be a book? That's right. Okay, how many of you are writing and it's going to be, like, you know, on screens? That's right. Okay, so this is why you should care about this. You should care about typography because it has a meaningful, it's like a whole other channel of communication you have. So let's talk a little bit about typography in the web. It's important to note that typography in the web is still kind of in its infancy compared to typography in print. Like, you know, we've been doing print and typography for hundreds of years, literally, since Gutenberg inventing the printing press. And we've had like a lot of time to develop like best practices and all kinds of cool stuff, none of which applies to the web yet, for reasons passing understanding. So all the things that I'm telling you about, a lot of them are derived from things that came from print, and now all of a sudden there are these new features that are starting to become available, new controls that allow you to, like, you know, level up your typography and get to the same level of type you have in books and in print. Sometimes they're hard to use, but they pay dividends and it's worth it, especially for somebody who's building something that's going to be read by people. You probably want to invest that time. So let's talk about type size. Sizing type is one of the three primary levers you have on controlling how your text is consumed, processed, how legible it is, how readable it is. What's the default size of text on the web? Who here knows? Shout it out.
12 points.
No.
1. 16.
16. Who said 16? You got a round of applause from me. Yes, 16. Like, you know, if you don't set anything, I'm not talking about headings, I'm talking about basic like text on the web, just like the body type. It's 16. 16 pixels. Okay? Why is it 16 pixels, right? It seems like weird. And the fact that people sort of by default, like, you know, say 12, that's actually an artifact from books, because books tend to be set like 11, 12 points, right? And so people tried to translate that. They're like, okay, on the web we should set it to 12. I don't know why they made it 16. That's a stupid default. Like, we should use 12, just like we've used 12, like, you know, all the time until now. But that's actually wrong, because we read books at a very different distance from our eyes than we read our screens usually. And, like, you know, law of physics, things that are further away appear to be smaller. Okay, there's no getting around that. And because, you know, we read screens at a further distance, you actually need the type to be slightly larger in order for it to be perceptibly the same size as text that you read in books. So what you're looking at here is actually like 12-point type in a magazine at normal reading distance, and 16-pixel type on a screen at normal reading distance. And you notice how they seem to appear to be the same size? That's why 16 is the default on the web. So how do we control type, right? It's actually better to work with proportions, not with, like, you know, absolute units like pixels, because now we have, like, you know, new devices with like higher density displays, like retina like devices and whatever. So pixels is actually kind of a dangerous, it's a minefield to work in. Typographers and generally anybody who works with styling text on the web likes to work with ems or percents. These are what's called relative units, and they're great because they're proportional. So when you're like drawing like a font, right? If you're a typographer and you're working at a foundry, you work inside a box called an M. What's an M? An M is a box that's roughly the size of an uppercase M. Why an uppercase M? Because it's the largest like single character in like the Roman alphabet. When you compare it to like pretty much everything except maybe a W. But anyway, an M is what everybody settled on. And you can notice that different type, this is times in Georgia, they're set at the same size. This is like, you know, like 70 point whatever, like times in Georgia. You can see that their metrics are actually very, very different. But each one, like you can talk about like one M, and then we'll get like a unit of measurement that is proportional to that font, that typeface, right? And that's why M's are fantastic. Because you can change like your type later, and you're not going to break your proportions if you have like a nice proportional layout. And M's are pretty easy to use, right? If you want to set, then you say, okay, like I'm going to say my body is going to be like 1.2 M's, and my header is going to be 3 M's. And how do you get to like the actual size of your type, like down in your H1? You just multiply, right? You go down the chain. At the root, it's always 1 M unless you've changed it. So 1 times 1.2 times 3 times 1.5, you end up with 5.4 EM, and that's the size of type that's going to be in this H1. Okay, that's how you figure it out. So it's not that complicated, right? Not too complicated. You just multiply your way down the chain. Okay, yeah. Let's check your knowledge now. How big is the H1? Like, what's the size of these H1s? First of all, let's try something easier. Are they going to be the same? Who thinks they're going to be the same? Who thinks they're going to be not the same? Who doesn't know at all? Okay. So given this markup and this sizing, how about if I give you color coding hints? Does this make it easier? No, not so much. So like, you know, basically you need to figure out what the chain is. Like I have these rules and I have this markup and I use the rules and I go down the chain of the markup and I say, okay, this is going to be that. But when I look at the other one, it actually turns out to be different. And this is the problem with M's, that you have to know, you have to keep this context in your head of where you are in the chain all the time. And that's difficult. It's hard to keep all that context in your head, right? It makes it very, very difficult to actually build anything of scale. So there's this new unit in CSS3 and you can start using it. It's called rems or root M's. And they're fantastic and they're wonderful. And this is basically what they are. They ignore everything except for the root. So you can have like one fundamental thing, like whatever the size you set in your HTML, and rems don't do the whole like multiplying cascade thing. They're relative to the root. And you can use them as like a single unit everywhere in sizing your type on the web for modern browsers only. Coming soon to theaters near you. But modern browsers, this is actually not that bad. Like IE9 has like, I mean, look, if you're working in some corporate environment and like you're stuck on IE8 and there's nothing you can do, then like I feel bad for you, son. I got 99 problems. There's actually a Polyfill, which is a little bit of JavaScript that you can actually load, and here's a link. You can like check it out later. And if you include this in your net, then like even old browsers like IE8 will magically become like aware of this like fantastic new unit called rems, and you can use them. So start using them, and you can start building these proportionate layouts without having to keep all of this like state of the chain in your head, which is one of the major like pains in the ass when designing anything with type. And it's not true that you always want rems. Sometimes you actually want the cascade. Sometimes you're saying like, I want this to be like like twice as large as whatever it's inside. Okay, and that's what M's are great for, because if I say I want it to be like two M's, then whatever it's inside, it will be twice as large as that. So sometimes that's a useful property, but most of the time it isn't, and that's what rems are going for. Now I know that I said typefaces are like a subset, and they're like a big subset, but they're still an important subset, so let's talk about typefaces. Sometimes you want to apply like a given font to, selectively to like a little bit of text, right? Like maybe I want to use like nicer ampersands, or I don't know, something else. And it's pretty easy, you can wrap up like a little bit of text in a span, and you have a class in it. You can use that class to set a different font family, and you get nicer type or some other font for a given thing. And that's cool. But this isn't actually like the most powerful part of how font selection and application works on the web. Font families are actually applied character by character. This is something that a lot of people don't actually get. It's not that like the web browser looks at the block of text and it's like, well, like the majority of the characters in here are English, and the first font can deliver on the majority of them. I'm going to use the first font for everything. No, it actually goes character by character and like chooses which character, which font of the stack to apply to each character based on like whether or not they have that character. So it goes along and it's using Helvetica, and then it runs into this umbrella, and it's just like, is there an umbrella in Helvetica? And Helvetica's like, nope, no umbrella here. So then it asks Ariel, do you have an umbrella? And like Ariel's like, nope, sorry, bro. And then it like hits sans serif, and then it's like, oh, okay, yeah, I got one over there. Here's an umbrella. And it does this character by character, so you can actually apply like a whole stack of fonts, and you can rest assured that it will always choose the one that you list earliest if it can. Okay, if that font supplies the character that you actually want. And this has a lot of very important implications, particularly for multilingual docs, right? If you want to have like different fonts, like I'm going to use this font for this language, but I don't want to use like the system default font for like some other language, and I want to mix the two in the same document. Great, you don't need to think about it that hard. You just like put the font that's special for like the other language ahead of like the default fonts, and it'll work out fine. Really, when you think about it, the browsers have like this database of fonts, right? How do you control this database? How do you put stuff in? How do you like specify? Well, there's this thing called Fontface, and Fontface is how you say to the browser, like, listen, I want to tell you about a new font. Its name is this. It's called foobar. And source, this is where you can find the file for this font, right? I can actually give you a URL. This is where the font is. You can load it like you load an image or anything else that a browser knows how to load, right? And you can even specify, I want you to use this font only for these Unicode characters. Like, I only want you to use it from here to here, like this range of Unicode characters. And the rest of these things are all properties you can say about this typeface. This is a bold, this is an italic, this is small caps, this is whatever, all these different things that you can say about this font. And you use it like this. So say I wanted to use like a fancy font for another language, say Hebrew, because I'm Israeli. So I have this other font, and I only want to use it for like the Hebrew ranges. Great. I define it, I say where the font is, I say this is the Unicode range that I want you to use it for, and then for my text, I simply list it earlier than the other ones, and it will get used only when there's Hebrew. Okay, great. And how is this useful for other things? It's also useful for random stuff, like say I have a font with like special math symbols, and I want to use that, but only for the math symbols. Same trick. It works really, really well, and all the browsers support this, even the old ones. So yeah, it's pretty cool. But be careful, because there are actually like some ways that you can shoot yourself in the leg while doing this and like totally breaking your user's experience. One of them is faux bold and faux italic. Say you ask a browser, like you give it a font, and you say, here, this is a bold, this is a regular font. And then you ask for like bold of that font. The browser doesn't actually have a bold. It looks around in the database, it's just like, I have the regular, don't have the bold, what to do, I'm gonna fake it. And that's exactly what the browser does. It faux bolds it. It takes like that. And it looks terrible. I didn't include a screenshot in my shit, but if you look this up on the internet, there's like a link here somewhere, yes? You will see that it looks terrible. And it does this for italic too. For italics, it literally just like slants the letters. like it stretches them like you do in Photoshop, which is like, whoop, yeah, it looks awful. You never ever want to do this. And so you need to be careful not to ask the font database for something that it doesn't have like this. And even if you have all the fonts and it's great, you still need to deal with this problem called the fout. Who here has heard of the fout? Who here hates the fout? Like with the passion of 1,000 burning suns. Yes, the fout is a major problem, right? All content on the web comes from somewhere, right? Like your servers to the clients, right? And if you're shipping a custom font, then that font needs to get to the browser somehow. And that takes time. Just like you download an image or anything. Fonts are actually as big as like images in many cases. And what happens while that downloading is going on, right? This is what happens in some browsers. You see like, like default type for a little bit until like the new font shows up, and then bam, it like replaces it. And that's the flash of unstyled text. You get like a little bit of like the default text before like your like fancier, like nicer font pops into view. Except it isn't even really that simple. It's actually more annoying than that. We have two problems. We have the fout and we have now the font. Because there isn't actually like a well-defined, like it's like my own personal Sophie's choice. There's two like different bad behaviors that can happen, and you have to choose between like the lesser of two evils. The flash of no text is the alternative. Like some browser makers were like, well, if I don't have the font, don't show anything. And some browser makers were like, if I don't have the font, then show the defaults. Which is more correct? There's no actual like specific answer. Yes, okay, right. I should have had this slide earlier when I was talking about images. Well, with images, when you download images, you can actually specify like this image is going to be like this wide and this tall, right? And this is great for browsers because the browser can then like save the space in like the layout and say like the space is eventually going to get filled in. So when the image actually does arrive, it doesn't trigger like a relaying out of all of the stuff. And with fonts, there's no way to do that. So the other problem that you face with fouts is a relaying out when like the real font shows up. So it actually changes the layout of your page, regardless of whether or not it's shown or not. Because you can see, even in the case of the font, where there's no text, it's using the metrics of like the default built-in thing, right? When you see in the beginning, it's like that up, and when it pops in, they both change their layout a little bit. So the font has problems, and this is when it's fast, right? This is when it takes less than 3 seconds to download your stuff. When you have more than 3 seconds to download, if it takes longer than 3 seconds, then browsers behave very differently. Some of them will show, after 3 seconds, they'll give up, like they'll show no text for 3 seconds, and then they'll show the flash of unstyled text until your font arrives. Some of them will keep holding on to like the blank screen until your font arrives. And that can take as long as it takes. And that's a lot of time that your users are looking at a screen and like not seeing anything, like no text at all. So that's really bad for user experience. So you want to make sure that you do a good job of like getting the fonts to your users as fast as possible, but be aware that like on bad connections, like when bad things happen, this is how they get bad. Okay, when it comes to typography on the web. There's a couple of like cool tools that can be used to make things easier. One of them is called Adobe Blank. It's a font that purports to have all of the characters. It says like, yep, I got them all. Like you ask me for an umbrella, it's like, yep, totally got an umbrella for you. But it doesn't. It's lying. Inside, it has blank characters for everything. Okay. So if you want to choose the font over the font, you can put this as like the second font in your like list of families. And then when it doesn't find your custom thing, like Adobe Blank is really tiny because it doesn't actually have any like characters. So it loads really fast, and then it's going to definitely be blank until your real font shows up and overrides it. So this is a cool little tool. For IE9, which is the greatest sufferer of the font, you can actually include the typeface itself. You can like encode it in base64 and shove it into CSS. And this actually makes IE9 behave better, not well, just better. And it like cuts down on the amount of time that you have a font. So you can fight the font this way with IE9. And most importantly, if you're coming from like a more developer-y background, cache fonts aggressively. Like you don't want people to have to download the font a second time. Like they come to your website once, they come back a month later. Like you want your font to still be in the browser's cache when that happens, so that the site pops up immediately and the content is like immediately pretty. So caching aggressively, really important part of like delivering good type on the web. There's also hope for the future. There's like a new spec in progress. It's totally a draft. It's going to be a while until we actually get this, but there's going to be like hooks that you can use to find out when fonts load in JavaScript, which is going to make it like a lot easier. And there's already some like JavaScript things, but this is like going to be a standard, and it's going to make life easy because you could say like you can actually, this gives you control over what happens between when like I know I don't have the font and now I have the font, and what should I do in the meantime. So the tools are getting better, and there's workarounds, but like be aware of like this stuff. Unfortunately, your journey towards really good type doesn't even end there. There's like more rabbit hole you can go down, and one of them is type rendering. So like fonts, what are fonts? Actually, they're like mathematical descriptions of outlines, right? Like these are the outlines, the curves that define like each letter. Okay, and there's a thing called a rasterizer. What does the rasterizer do? It says like I'd like this font at this size on the screen at this location. Figure out which pixels to turn on and which ones to leave off. Okay, that's what a rasterizer does. It turns outlines into pixels. And it turns out that there's actually a lot of art to this. It's not like straight up science. There's no like one right way to do this. And different operating systems do this in a completely different fashion. And this is what leads to like web fonts looking weird and different on different browsers. So on the Mac, there's just one. There's one rasterizer to rule them all, Cortex. And it looks like this. But on Windows, you actually have three different rasterizers that could be used. There's the old one, which is GDI, and that comes in 2 flavors, and DirectWrite, which is the new one, and it looks a little bit more like Mac OS. And it's a little hard to see, but even here you can see that the OS X one, like at the smallest sizes, the type looks a little bit heavier, a little bit smoother. It's like it's dipped in chocolate, right? And like on Windows, like GDI, particularly grayscale, can often come out looking like a little bit like thin and pixelated, like not dipped in chocolate, not delicious at all. Whereas like the whole, like the new hotness, like the DirectWrite stuff, that looks nice and really well done. And it's unfortunate, but it's you even need to know about what kind of font you have, because which rasterizer is chosen depends on whether or not it's a PostScript font or a TrueType font. And if your ears and your eyes are not already bleeding from like the annoyance and strain of this, then I don't know, like you're a calmer person than I. This is the table of like, how do you know which one will get used on Windows? Like if you have like IE 6 through 8 and it's not Windows XP and it's a TrueType font, then it'll be ClearType, or something like that. But the good news is that all of this is eventually moving towards DirectWrite. Like old IE is dying out, and like Windows XP is not going to be around for long. Like all of these, except in developing countries in China and stuff. Hopefully IE6 will die like soon, for good. So it is getting better, and DirectWrite is really actually fantastic. It's a great typewriting thing. So. The bottom line, test your intended typefaces. Like you have a typeface that looks great on your Mac, make sure you test it on a bunch of PCs, old PCs, different browsers, because you need to see how it renders in all of these environments. Like use this table, go one by one, be like, did I check it in this? Did I check it in this? Did I check it in this? There's whole services you can use, like Browser Stack or whatever. They give you like, I want like IE6 on Windows XP, give it to me now. And see how the type actually comes out. So test, it's really important to test. Okay. Right. Enough of this doom and gloom. Like, let's talk about like cool stuff that we can do now, right? Like fun stuff, like ligatures, right? Who here knows what a ligature is? Okay, so ligatures. When you have like two different letters that should connect in like a special fashion, like pairs that like when you put them next to one another, they should actually be rendered differently. You have this most importantly in script fonts, but not just in script fonts. There's actually ligatures used all the time. Open up a book the next time you open up like any print book and look for like FF or FFI or FFT, and you'll see that they actually change the shapes of the letters. Like if you have like an FF, they'll draw like one crossbar across the two Fs and tighten them up a little bit. You've probably never noticed this unless you're a typographer, but every book you've ever seen printed has this, okay? Special combinations of letters that are like tweaked subtly to make them a little bit more legible. So ligatures, now we can start using ligatures on the web. There's like toggles to like enable ligatures. For a long time we couldn't, and this was one of the like, sort of like classier things in typography. There's also different kinds of numerals, right? There's 4 kinds of numerals. There's actually more than 4, but 4 that you really should care about. And for a long time, you couldn't actually use them on the web. People have been taking this for granted in print for literally hundreds of years, and now we're finally getting to use them on the web. 4 different kinds of numbers. What are the 4 different kinds of numbers? There's old style figures and lining figures. Old style figures look like a mix of lowercase and uppercase for Latin alphabet. Right? If you have running text, in your running text, if you have old style figures, you want to use old style figures. Okay? As opposed to lining figures, which are always the height of a capital letter. And sometimes you want to use that. Like if you have a dashboard and you're like, we had 96 hits yesterday, like a short little bit of text next to like some numerals, then you probably want them to be like the full height. Because if you just had like, like 56 like hits and the 5 like went underneath the baseline and the 6 went above, then that's going to look a little funky when you have it like especially set big. So you can actually specify like the right kinds. And there's proportional and tabular numbers, right? If you've got typewrite the width of a 1 and the width of a 0, not the same width, right? The same way that like the width of a like lowercase I and the width of a like uppercase H are not the same width, right? Numerals can also be proportional or like monospaced. But if you're doing something tabular, like I need to like have a thing that at the bottom there's going to be a sum, then you want all the numerals to line up. Even if you're using a serif font, you can actually specify if that serif font has tabular numerals. You can specify now on the web in your CSS, like, I want tabular numerals for this. So you can like deliver a better like, experience with reading these numbers. How do you do that? There's this thing called font feature settings. The 4-letter codes are really cryptic, but you can look them up. There's like whole tables of like, if I want this, then like use this like 4-letter magic incantation. But they're pretty like pretty easy to like. Why are they 4 letters? It's like historical reasoning of like long ago antiquity that you shouldn't actually care about. But here, even for like lining and tabular, it's pretty easy. Lnum, tnum, whatever. And they work in most of the browsers. And the nice thing about them is that if you don't have them, they're like nice to have. They like enhance the quality of like your typography. And if the browser doesn't understand them, say it's like IE9 or earlier, then so what? Then you're just going to end up with like the wrong kinds of numerals. Your content will still be legible, just won't be as good as it could be. It won't be like as classy. So this is like a free thing you can do to like level up your typing, like be classier. That's a lot of stuff. Who here feels like their brain is like melting out of their ears? Yes? Okay, good, success. It's okay, like this is like a ton of things that are slowly gonna work their way into the mainstream because now they're starting to get, like reach critical mass in terms of like what browsers support them and like new IE support all this stuff. And new IE eventually becomes old IE and we're gonna have this everywhere. And like I said, most of these enhancements, like they're free. Like they're free enhancements. You don't need to like worry about whether or not they're gonna like ruin things for your users. Usually, like except for the caveats that I point out. And one day you'll wake up and it's supported everywhere. And if you want to know how like adoption of features is progressing, there's this great site called caniuse.com. You open up caniuse.com and you type in like some feature and it gives you like an auto-completed list of like font feature settings. This is supported in this browser and that browser in these versions. And for every feature and thing that you can do on the web, caniuse.com can tell you stuff about that. Go make stuff. Go make it better. Go make it more legible. Like use this stuff to like get your message across with like the same class and panache that print typographers have been able to do for years. And thank you.
About the Adobe Blank.
Yes.
We were talking in the beginning about how different fonts will have actual different size, even though they're the same size.
Yeah, Adobe Blank has like some metric that's like it's like a very like sort of middle of the road.
Right. So how do you if you use Adobe Blank, you said you were talking about problem with the web page relaying out. Itself.
You're gonna have that problem.
So that doesn't solve that.
It doesn't solve that problem, but it does solve the problem of showing like a different font first. Like you will still have like the jump when it like relays out, but you're not gonna have like I'm gonna show a different font, and then I'm gonna like you'll have like blank, and then you're gonna have something but not the right something, and then you're gonna have the right something. Like the Adobe Blank, like it excises that middle step. You're just gonna have blank, and then you're gonna have Adobe Blank, and then you're gonna have the real thing. So it doesn't solve the relaying out, but it does solve the showing like the wrong font problem for IE9 specifically.
Other questions?
Hi. So I'm one of those people who are writing something for print, my thesis.
My condolences.
So, is there anything you would, I would like my thesis to be available as an HTML page too, but do you have any way to make them consistent?
Like, is it something like scientific you're writing in LaTeX?
Particle physics.
Yeah, I mean, like you can run this. You know what? I've never actually I haven't looked. My wife did a PhD, and I looked at LaTeX when she was writing her thesis, and I was just like, oh my god, I'm so glad I never have to use this. And maybe there's like something that like a LaTeX to web converter, but I have no idea how good that converter is and whether or not it uses any of this stuff. So I don't know. Also, like thesis stuff, things produced by LaTeX have like a very specific look to them. Like they all look the same, and I don't know how to like achieve that on the web. But I imagine somebody's tried. Google it, and if not, maybe go write it because it would be good for everyone else.
Actually, you have a tool which is named Pandoc, and you can generate like SVG, your LaTeX formula. You can generate them as SVG, so it will scale and work properly and be mix up.
See, the power of open source.
Yeah, Pandoc is definitely a good tool. You can convert like Markdown in PDF, XML, whatever you want. It's really a very good machine.
So it just creates like vector outlines of everything?
Yeah, exactly. So you can take that and put that as an image somewhere else, and that works perfectly. So it displays well in the browser, and you can print that on paper as well. So, magic.
Yeah, I got this really silly question, so I'd like to apologize beforehand. Really stupid. Oh my god, it's really stupid. Okay.
I'm pretty sure it's not as bad as you think.
No, I'm just starting to realize it as I talk. All right. The problem with the content taking less space than it must while it's loading is an old problem, and it was first, I guess, presented by images, which are, as you said, browsers do reserve space for images, but visually they do load from top to bottom. So visually they take less space in the beginning and then more gradually as they load. And the solution to this problem is loading it progressively. So you first load an image in a very low quality, which looks like a fuzzy and foggy thing, but it does cover the same visual space as it should. And I just wonder, why don't we have that type of thing for fonts? Why can't we load them terribly, then load them better, but they would take the same space? That would be fun.
So the problem. So remember, I was talking about the rasterizer, the thing that figures out how to take outlines and turn them into pixels. And it's a problem of like either you have all the information and you can render the type and figure out how big the type will be. And when I say all the information, literally you need to know like the size of all the letters. And there's even like hinting. It's like little rules. Like if I have like an uppercase A next to an uppercase V, like say I'm writing the word wave, like in big, okay? Like you actually want to like snug the two together, right? Like the A and the V, so that they're like tucked in. Like the bottom part of the A and the upper part of the V are going to actually be on top of one another. Otherwise, it'll look funny if they're like this. If they're just like an A and then a V over here. And that kind of information, like you literally need all of the font information for the rasterizer to be able to like lay the type out and then tell you this is how big it's going to be. So the only way to actually like figure out this sort of like this low resolution like data, it's you'd still need to download a copy of the font, like in order to figure it out. So why do that twice? Maybe there's, I've never heard of anything that's like sort of like low resolution preview. I don't even know like enough technically about this to know if this is possible, but I don't think so because you need that information for the rasterizer.
Why are they so big?
Lots and lots of outlines. They're not huge. They're like I don't know, a given typeface, depending on how many characters, how many glyphs are in the text. This is actually one of like the things you do to like optimize web fonts is you want to like subset your font to use only the glyphs that you need. Like if you have some gigantic font that covers like Latin alphabets, but also like Eastern European and like whatever, all these other things and all these crazy accents, but you know that like you're only writing in English, then you can actually like chop out all of that content from your font and make it smaller before you serve it up to your users, and you should do that. And there's tools for doing that. But it's when you think about like all the different characters, there's just a ton of them, like, and it adds up to a few hundred K. I guess, yeah, maybe we could have like, I'm sure there's hacks for like, doing multiple, like, I'll have the same font with different subsets and I'll serve it up in like differently for different locales. That would be like a cool optimization. I wonder if somebody's done that. Oh, right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Use content negotiation to like serve up the correct font. But I wonder if anyone's done that. I don't know. I've never actually run into it.
Hey, so resources for discovering and choosing fonts. I've never found anything that I've been happy with because the only resources that I have found kind of present a library of fonts, but that doesn't give me a kind of curated or a styled way of being able to go and visualize, I just go and it's just overwhelming. Yeah. So anywhere that I should be looking?
Art school. I'm sorry, like this is the worst answer. I hate having people are like, how do you choose fonts? Like many things, experience, and there's best practices. The science on like which fonts you choose, like here's the science. The science is, it doesn't matter. Okay? There's like lots of bunk out there, like you should use serif for running text, and you should use sans serif for headers, and this is like accepted wisdom. But like all of the science that's ever been done about how fast people are able to like read and comprehend the content, it's not actually tied very much to like whether or not you use this kind of font or that kind of font. There's differences in believability. Like they did a study at the New York Times where they laid out like the same text in like different fonts from like Times to like Comic Sans, and then they asked people like, are you convinced by this assertion? And there was like, between like the worst, Comic Sans, and the best, which was, I don't remember which one it was, like Times. There was like a 1.5% agreement advantage. So like 1.5% more people agreed with like the better type, like the type that was more appropriate to the message. But that's as far as like type selection goes. Like there isn't like hard and fast rules of like which is better. There's only which is better for your audience and your content. And the rest is, aesthetics and like choosing good type is like anything you acquire it over time through usage of type. I can't think off the top of my head now of like, awesome places that you can see like font pairings, but I know these exist if you like Google like, show me awesome like font pairings, because generally you want to use like at most 2 fonts. Until you know what you're doing, then maybe 3, but even that's like tricky. So like you want to choose like 2 fonts that work together that provide some amount of contrast, and that's like the sort of the very high level advice. Doing one more. I can also answer questions later.
Especially in a lot of technical writing, you will need free fonts, like as you said, for headers and for running text, and then something to display code well, for instance, or configuration or whatever.
Yeah, less that. That's not what I meant by a third font. A third font that you're using in like body text as part of something.
Cool. Great. Well, thank you, Idan.
Thank you.